For more than 3 years, the war between Russia and Ukraine has dominated global politics, reshaped alliances, shaken economies, and revived fears of a large-scale conflict in Europe. What began in February 2022 as a rapid military invasion has evolved into one of the most complex geopolitical confrontations of the 21st century. Cities have been destroyed, millions of people have been displaced, and the world has watched as the balance of power between major nations shifted dramatically. Now, after years of battlefield stalemate, sanctions, and political pressure, peace talks are once again emerging as a possibility. The possibility of negotiations is not just another diplomatic meeting. It represents the first serious attempt in months to explore whether the war can be brought to an end through political compromise rather than continued fighting. Governments around the world are watching closely because the outcome could influence global security, energy markets, military alliances, and the future of international diplomacy. At the center of this moment are three powerful leaders whose decisions could shape the future of Europe. One is Vladimir Putin, the leader who ordered the invasion and whose strategic objectives have guided Russia's military campaign from the beginning. Another is Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the wartime president who has become a global symbol of resistance and whose government insists that Ukraine must preserve its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The third major figure influencing negotiations is Donald Trump, whose administration has pushed for renewed diplomatic efforts while simultaneously maintaining military and economic pressure on Russia. The current round of negotiations is expected to take place in Geneva, a city long associated with international diplomacy. For decades, Geneva has hosted negotiations on nuclear weapons, humanitarian law, and conflict resolution. Its reputation as neutral ground makes it an ideal location for discussions involving countries that remain deeply suspicious of each other. The road to these talks has been long and difficult. Since the early months of the war, multiple attempts at negotiation have collapsed. Early talks in 2022 produced temporary agreements on humanitarian corridors and prisoner exchanges, but broader political settlements proved impossible. Both sides believed they could still achieve their goals on the battlefield. As a result, diplomacy stalled while fighting intensified. Over time, however, the war settled into a brutal stalemate. Russian forces consolidated control over parts of eastern and southern Ukraine, building defensive fortifications and strengthening their logistical networks. Ukrainian forces, supported by Western weapons and intelligence, launched counteroffensives aimed at reclaiming occupied territory. Some operations succeeded, others failed, and the front lines shifted slowly while casualties mounted on both sides. The human cost of the conflict has been enormous. Entire cities have been reduced to rubble. Families have been separated by borders and displacement. Millions of Ukrainian citizens fled their homes during the early stages of the war, seeking refuge in neighboring countries. Others remained behind, living under constant threat from missile strikes and artillery bombardments. The destruction of infrastructure has affected electricity supplies, transportation networks, and agricultural production, creating long-term economic challenges for the country. Russia has also faced significant consequences. Western sanctions targeted banks, energy companies, technology imports, and financial institutions. These sanctions were designed to weaken Russia's ability to fund the war and restrict access to advanced technology. Although the Russian economy adapted in some areas, the sanctions still imposed serious constraints, forcing Moscow to redirect trade and deepen economic relationships with non-Western partners. The war also transformed the global security landscape. Military alliances strengthened and expanded as countries reconsidered their defense strategies. The most notable development involved NATO, which increased its presence in Eastern Europe and welcomed new members. The expansion of NATO became one of the most controversial aspects of the conflict, as Russian officials argued that the alliance's growth threatened their national security. Meanwhile, political leaders across Europe debated how to support Ukraine while avoiding direct confrontation with Russia. The European Union implemented sanctions, provided financial assistance, and coordinated humanitarian aid. European governments also faced domestic pressure from rising energy prices and economic uncertainty, which were partly linked to disruptions in global energy markets caused by the war. Energy became one of the most important geopolitical battlegrounds of the conflict. Russia had long been one of the world's largest exporters of natural gas and oil, supplying large portions of Europe's energy needs. When the war began and sanctions were imposed, many European countries rushed to reduce their dependence on Russian energy. This triggered a dramatic restructuring of energy supply chains, including increased imports of liquefied natural gas from other regions and accelerated investment in renewable energy infrastructure. At the same time, global food markets experienced turbulence. Ukraine is one of the world's largest exporters of grain and agricultural products, and disruptions to shipping routes affected supply chains in many developing countries. International organizations warned that prolonged instability in the region could worsen food insecurity in parts of Africa and the Middle East. Against this backdrop, the idea of peace negotiations carries enormous significance. Ending the war would not only stop the immediate violence, but also help stabilize global markets, restore trade routes, and reduce geopolitical tensions that have spread far beyond Eastern Europe. Yet the path to peace is filled with difficult questions. One of the most contentious issues involves territory. Russia currently controls several regions of eastern and southern Ukraine that it considers strategically important. Ukrainian leaders insist that these territories must be returned as part of any peace agreement. For Ukraine, accepting permanent territorial losses would be politically and emotionally devastating. For Russia, withdrawing from areas it has fought to control could be seen domestically as a strategic defeat. Another major issue involves security guarantees. Ukraine wants assurances that it will be protected from future aggression. During the war, the country received extensive military assistance from Western nations, but long-term security arrangements remain uncertain. Some proposals involve formal defense commitments from allied countries, while others suggest neutral status combined with international guarantees. Russia, on the other hand, has its own security concerns. Russian officials argue that the expansion of Western military alliances near their borders created strategic pressure that contributed to the conflict. A third issue concerns reconstruction. Ukraine's infrastructure has suffered massive damage during the war. Roads, bridges, housing, power plants, and industrial facilities will require extensive rebuilding. International financial institutions estimate that reconstruction costs could reach hundreds of billions of dollars. Negotiators will need to address who will fund this rebuilding effort and how the process will be managed. Prisoner exchanges are also expected to play a role in the negotiations. Thousands of soldiers from both sides have been captured during the fighting. Previous exchanges have taken place, but many prisoners remain in detention. Large-scale exchanges could serve as a confidence-building measure that signals progress in the talks. Despite the enormous challenges, several factors are encouraging renewed diplomatic efforts. One factor is war fatigue. After years of fighting, both militaries face logistical strain, personnel losses, and economic pressure. Even governments that remain committed to their strategic goals recognize that prolonged conflict carries increasing risks. Another factor is international pressure. Many countries outside Europe want the conflict to end because of its economic and political consequences. Rising energy costs, supply chain disruptions, and geopolitical tensions have affected economies around the world. Diplomatic actors hope that negotiations could eventually stabilize the situation. There is also a strategic calculation taking place in global politics. Major powers are closely observing the war because it offers lessons about modern warfare, alliances, and economic sanctions. Some analysts believe that ending the conflict through negotiation could prevent further escalation. One country watching the negotiations closely is China. China has maintained a complex position during the conflict, calling for diplomatic solutions while avoiding direct condemnation of Russia. Beijing's stance reflects its broader strategic interests, including maintaining stable relations with multiple global partners and preventing further fragmentation of the international system. The potential outcomes of the peace talks vary widely. In the most optimistic scenario, negotiators reach a comprehensive agreement that ends the fighting, establishes security guarantees, and launches a long-term reconstruction plan for Ukraine. Such an agreement would represent one of the most significant diplomatic breakthroughs in recent history. Another possibility is a ceasefire agreement that freezes the conflict. In this scenario, both sides agree to stop active fighting along existing front lines while negotiations continue. This type of arrangement could reduce immediate violence but might leave unresolved tensions. A third possibility is that negotiations fail entirely. Diplomatic talks often collapse when both sides remain too far apart on key issues. If this happens, the war could continue for years, with periodic escalations and continued humanitarian suffering. Regardless of the outcome, the current moment represents a turning point in the conflict. For the first time in months, there is renewed discussion about diplomacy rather than battlefield developments. The fact that negotiations are being prepared indicates that political leaders recognize the importance of exploring alternatives to endless war. History shows that many conflicts eventually end at the negotiating table rather than on the battlefield. Wars often reach a point where neither side can achieve decisive victory, forcing leaders to consider compromise. These compromises are rarely satisfying for all parties involved, but they can create a framework for stability and recovery. For Ukraine, the ultimate goal remains preserving its sovereignty and rebuilding its nation. For Russia, the challenge lies in balancing strategic objectives with the economic and political costs of prolonged conflict. For the broader international community, the priority is preventing further escalation. As diplomats gather and preparations for negotiations continue, the world is once again focused on the possibility of peace. The road ahead will not be easy. Deep mistrust, political pressures, and strategic calculations will shape every stage of the discussions. Whether these talks lead to a historic agreement or simply become another chapter in a long diplomatic struggle remains to be seen. But one thing is clear: the decisions made in the coming months could influence the future of Europe for decades to come.